The difference between Promise.any and Promise.race is that Promise.any is going to return a single promise that resolves as soon as possible, but the race doesn't care whether the promise resolves or rejects. Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're gonna show the difference between Promise.any method and Promise.race method, and I'm going to show you how you can implement your own Promise.race method and Promise.any method. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's first look at an example of how you can use Promise.race method. Here I have two promises set up, and if I call Promise.race method, this is going to take an array of promises, and then I can chain the then method because the Promise.race method is going to return a new promise. By chaining the then method on this return promise, I can add this handler, which is the console.log method, to the return promise. So as soon as any of these promises fulfills or rejects, it's going to log out the first promise that fulfilled rejected. So in this case, my first promise resolves in 500 milliseconds, and my second promise resolves in 100 milliseconds. So in this case, the second promise should resolve first. So the Promise.race is going to log out the value returned from the second promise. And suppose if I have reject here, then the rejected value from the second promise is also going to be logged out. So here I'm going to add like a failure handler, just so that it can log out a rejected promise value. As you can see, once I added this failure handler, it triggers the code pen to refresh itself, and then I can see the 2 is logged out as expected. Okay, so let me refresh my page again, and then this time I'm going to say resolve, but 50 milliseconds. The return value is actually 1 in this case. Okay, now let's see an example of the Promise.any method. The Promise.any method is going to return the first fulfilled promise. The difference between Promise.any and Promise.race is that Promise.any is going to return a single promise that resolves as soon as possible, as soon as any of the promises fulfills, but the race doesn't care whether the promise resolves or rejects. So in this case, here I have 3 promises, and then I'm going to put the 3 promises in a promises array. The first promise is going to reject itself immediately. The second promise resolves 100 milliseconds. The third promise resolves in 500 milliseconds. So in this case, as soon as any of these promises fulfills, it's going to log out the first fulfilled promise. In this case, it would be the quick promise, because our first promise actually rejects, so it didn't go to this successful callback. So now you know the difference between Promise.any and Promise.race method. Let's go ahead and see how we can implement this using our own implementation. Alright, let's first look at how we can implement the Promise.race method. This method is going to take an iterable of promises. An iterable simply just means any object that implements the iteration protocol. In our case, we can simplify it to become like an array of promises just for simplicity. This method is going to return a new promise that resolves or rejects whenever the first promise in this promises array resolves or rejects, which makes this implementation easier because we just care about the first promise it resolves or rejects. The way we achieve that is we are going to attach handlers to each promise inside this promises array, and for each of the promise, when they resolves, it's going to also resolve the new promise, and when it rejects, it's also going to reject the new promise with the rejection arrow. Simple like this. The reason I'm using Promise.resolve here is because the Promise.resolve method is going to return the promise itself if p is already a promise, but if p is a primitive value, then this would return a new promise that resolves to the primitive value. That way we can attach the handlers to the promise. Alright, Now let's take a look at how we can implement Promise.any method. Before I go into details, I want to give you a recap on Promise.all method, because if you think carefully, Promise.any method is exact opposite of Promise.all method. Promise.all method returns a new promise that would resolve with the aggregated results from all the promises, or it would reject with the arrow from the first rejected promise. Promise.any is the exact opposite. It is going to return a promise that resolves with the value from the first resolved promise, and it's going to reject with the aggregated arrows from all the rejected promise. So with that in mind, our implementation also leveraged the fact that Promise.any and Promise.all is the exact opposite. So we created a new list of promises. So what's happening here is we have created a inversion list of promises from the original promises, and each of these new promise is going to reject when the original promise resolves. So why this is working is because suppose we have three promise, P1, P2, and P3, and suppose P1 resolves itself first, the new promise is going to be rejected. And Promise.all notice that rejection immediately. It rejects the new promise. We attach a handler saying that whenever there's an arrow thrown, we are going to resolve the new promise. And now let's think about the case when P1 and P2 and P3 all rejected. In that scenario, when these promises all reject, the new promise actually is going to resolve, and Promise.all does nothing but patiently wait for all the promises to resolve. So after all the original promises reject itself, the new promise all resolves, and Promise.all also resolves. In that scenario, we then reject the new promise with their aggregated arrows. So that's how this is worked. And let me know if you have any comments.